Hi there, and welcome to episode 7 of the Sustainable Community Life podcast. I'm Alan Adler, your host, and I've been excited about this episode because I've been wrestling with the combination of the delusion of separateness and how that's related to entitlements that we have for ownership, comfort, and convenience. And in this essay that I wrote that I'm going to share with you, called The Delusion of Separateness and Confronting Our Entitlements, I'm going to make the argument that somewhere along the lines, we got duped by the industrial consumer economy into believing that we were going to meet our needs by simply buying our way to happiness. And even though logically we know that doesn't work, we know that every time we think something's going to make us happy if we buy it, that it's only a matter of time before we realize, well, that didn't really work. We're still caught in the loop. And there's so much peer pressure on how big is this and how big is that, who's got this. We're basically living not only in an optical delusion of separateness, but also the canonical greyhound chasing after the rabbit never will catch that rabbit. And meanwhile, we're all in deep trouble with the polycrisis, and our species, as I've said many times, is careening on the edge of extinction. So in today's podcast, I'd like to address how ownership, comfort, and convenience and the entitlement associated with them have trapped us in a me-centered, sociological, ideological trap that is very much tied to many of the problems that I talk about wanting to resolve in the sustainable community life movement. So let's start with a quote from Einstein. Einstein is famous for saying, "A human being is part of the whole called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. And this delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us." Einstein continues that our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. That's quite a lovely quote. Building on Einstein's idea that separateness is delusional, perhaps our me-centered society, based on this idea that I am entitled to have the things I want and I am looking to have the conveniences and comforts provide me with what I need, is really the central reason why sustainable community life is such an unrealistic and faraway dream. So let's begin this discussion with a deep bow to the intelligence of human psychology and evolution. There's a reason why people don't feel pain and worry about things that they don't feel they have much agency for. There's a reason why we avoid confronting difficult things. It has to do with our adaptation and our unique ability to take painful and seemingly bridge too far issues and essentially push them into our unconscious so that we continue to function day to day. And over time, as the normal becomes more and more abnormal, it becomes normalized. And the pains associated with the traumas we feel when our hearts are broken or when we're hurt become frozen within us and become a distant part of our unconscious terrain. And we don't see any relevance in them in our day-to-day life until, and this is the important part, we have an awakening that forces us to confront that which has remained unconscious, for which we cannot meet our purpose on the earth by not dealing with whatever it is that we pushed away. So in my own journey, I spent the vast majority of my life living in Einstein's optical delusion of separateness until I discovered the deep fulfillment that I got associated with being connected in community. I had an experience 4 years ago where I tasted the fruit of intimacy at a community level. And once I tasted that, there was no going back. And my heart started to break wide open. And I began to melt the ice that kept my heart from feeling love. And I began my process to find and live in intentional community because I realized that it wasn't just good enough to have it occasionally, this intimacy and connection. I wanted it to be my everyday. My journey has led me to believe that human beings are not supposed to live in isolation, and that the toxic normalization of the isolation of ownership, convenience, and comfort in the absence of the trifecta that I mentioned helps me have compassion for the loneliness, isolation, and destruction of the natural environment, the exploitation, the extraction, the economic systems across all dimensions of human society and planetary life. The reason I talk about having compassion is because none of us chose to live in an exploitative system, but we do vote with our dollars every day. And my compassion is not to blame each and every one of us for wasting cups and throwing away plastic bags and not being mindful of the fact that every time we get into an airplane, we consume 7 times the CO2 than if we were driving. It's more that we just don't have the tools to deal with that in a way where we can allow our hearts to break and really feel, unless we make a conscious and deliberate choice to do that. And I'm arguing that is an essential part of the journey, is to start to care, as I talked about in episode 6, on a really fundamental level for the heartbreak of the exploitation and the extraction of our precious earth by the ways that we live sociologically and economically. So I don't know if I would go so far as to say that we can't own anything if we want to have sustainability in our lives and our communities. I would not go so far as to say that we have to sacrifice all of our convenience and our comfort, but we do need to get super conscious about how ownership, comfort, and convenience and our entitlement have gotten in the way of living with the earth, have caused us to engage in economic systems that are non-regenerative and don't support nature and people, and how in the process of buying into the BS that these things are going to make us happy, we've essentially disconnected from ourselves from the meaning that comes when we relate to each other in a community that has economic and ecological perspectives tied to the trifecta of social relations. So today's single-family home, the opposite of intentional community, where we live locally and in a shared environment, it seems quite obviously to be built on Einstein's optical delusion of consciousness. So our general preoccupation with ownership, being comfortable, acquiring conveniences, is really out of sync with that trifecta. So much so that we need to examine how our societal and economic models, designed to provide us with meaning and quality of life, are actually doing the opposite, creating a world that's ecologically on the brink. We're chasing after money, we're living in isolation, we're lonely, and we're despairing. Let's look at some statistics. In a survey by Singa a few years ago, it was revealed that 60% of adults reported feeling lonely. And catch this, 43% say they lack companionship, felt their relationships are not meaningful, and felt isolated from others. And almost 4 in 10, just be with this for a minute, felt they no longer felt close to anyone. 39% said they no longer feel close to anyone. That is tragic. And that tragedy is not just an emotional level, it's actually at a health risk level. The Surgeon General says that kind of loneliness is comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And a meta-analysis that was published in the Journal of PLOS Medicine found that loneliness and social isolation can increase the risk of premature death by more than a quarter. So we have ourselves a loneliness epidemic, an ecological epidemic, and we can find the connection to it in our economics, where we preoccupy with ownership, convenience, and comfort, which are not purpose-built to address loneliness or ecological challenges. And if you marry this phenomenon of the loneliness epidemic with the socioeconomic disaster of the industrial consumer economy, we can clearly see that the epidemic is directly related to the opposite of the trifecta. So then how can we reconcile the need to live with more intentionality, more care for the earth, and engage in local economics to support the trifecta while also providing ourselves with creature comforts, including our home, our possessions that make our lives more enjoyable? I think it's silly to expect that we're going to flip from heads to tails, but maybe on the edge of the coin, we can start to wake up to the fact that the cost of something is not related to how much money we pay for it. So if we go and buy a sandwich and it costs $15, that does not adequately cover the ecological or social factors that need to be considered in every single one of our industrial consumer activities. I think that the unconsciousness that I experience when I see how people waste and how people treat the environment needs to be put in context so we can realize just how big a problem we have. Like in prior podcasts, I've talked about how the earth is clearly tipping into crises ecologically, and we've already crossed 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries. And you can just look at this in terms of human behavior and see just how much this is a function of what we choose. Every single time you go to the coffee store and you get a disposable cup, you're contributing to the 16 billion disposable coffee cups that are used globally. Every time you go to the supermarket and you buy something and you get a plastic bag, That's contributing to the 100 billion plastic bags just in the US, only which of 1% is recycled. These are bags that cause pollution, harm wildlife and ecosystems. When you fly, the environment is impacted 7 times more than if you drive. That's a function of the CO2 of flying, and also that the CO2 is happening at a high altitude. So it directly contributes to global warming and to carbon absorption. So these are just consciousness dimensions, things to think about as we start to go from thinking about how much something costs in dollars to thinking about how much something costs in the price that we're paying in terms of taking away air to breathe and soil from our children. It does strike me that however we come out of this, to the extent that we can, and I do believe we can create lifeboats for the sinking ship of the industrial consumer economy, but we got to start building these lifeboats now. We won't be given the privilege of building lifeboats when the supertanker is sinking. We have to build them before the supertanker sinks. And however we approach the lifeboats, it's going to require that we constrain this well-trained consumption muscle in order to get out of the mess we're in. Perhaps the model of restraint that we have to put ourselves through can be thought of more as a trade-off for meaning than a sacrifice for comfort. What I mean by that is that if I am going so fast that I believe that the only way that I'm going to be happy is to have instant gratification, buy something, have something, then I don't give myself an opportunity to really breathe into the idea that maybe there are other ways to go. Maybe I can actually wait to buy that or wait to experience that until such time as it can be done in community. Maybe rather than driving to the store to buy mushrooms for my coq au vin, I can wait and go to the store with a friend and we can make the coq au vin together. So I get lower cost because we're sharing the drive. I get lower cost because we're sharing the cost of the mushrooms, and I get social connection because we're driving in the car together. So this is what I mean by realizing that the trade-off is not a sacrifice as much as it is an opportunity for more meaning. So I hope that you found this discussion about the underlying dynamics of entitlement as it relates to the delusion of separateness interesting, and I can't wait to see you next time.